And what of the people of Japan and their so-called divine origin? Anthropologists say the original inhabitants of the islands were a hairy barbarian people called Ainus. Later on, fierce Mongolian tribes moved in and began conquering the Ainus. Still later, other tribes from many sources arrived on the scene. The fusion of all these tribes and races resulted in the Japanese of today, not of one pure blood, but of a well-mixed plasma cocktail of Ainu, Mongol, Manchu, Malaysian. Of the history of Japan, historians say that somewhere around the beginning of the Christian era, they elevated to leadership a chief or high priest, in this case the emperor, who claimed to have an inside track with the gods. This evolved into Shintoism, and the emperor's son myth became the dominant religion. But the early emperors had little political power, for the islands were really divided into many independent and quarrelsome tribes, ruled over by powerful barons or daimyos. These daimyos each had large, well-paid private armies of warriors called samurai. The samurai were the important and privileged class, real aristocrats who lived off the fat of the land without working. As a badge of rank, they wore two swords, a short sword for committing harakiri when captured or disgraced, and a large two-handed sword they fought with. With this sword, it was their privilege to lop off heads, arms, or ears of the peasants, either for practice or amusement. To further set themselves apart from the common herd, the samurai developed a code of rules for themselves called Bushido, the code of the warrior. Bushido extolled absolute loyalty to one's superior and reckless bravery in battle. But most important, Bushido not only sanctioned double dealing and treachery, but looked upon it as an art to be cultivated. It encouraged ambush. Jump a man from behind when he's unarmed and you've got a club. When he's alone and you've got a gang. That's Bushido, the art of treachery and the double cross, the national code of Japan. Harakiri was also a privilege of the samurai. When condemned to death, they were allowed to kill themselves rather than be beheaded. The executioner's axe was for the common people. As a result, harakiri became an elaborate ceremony, a form of art that showed bravery and indifference to pain. A man's son or his best friend stood by with a big sword to chop his head off in case he lost his nerve. Being the shogun meant being top dog among all the daimyos, a dictator of dictators, ruling the islands in the name of the emperor, who was kept in the background as a religious figurehead.
In the year 1592, the powerful shogun Hideyoshi thought he and Japan were strong enough to make their first bid to cover the world with a Japanese roof. And as they have ever since, they picked China as the first victim. Hideyoshi invaded Korea, but Chinese from other provinces came to the aid of the Koreans. The Japs were stopped, and when Hideyoshi died suddenly, the invasion was called off. But they did a complete job of plunder, taking back with them all the wealth and art they could carry. They also brought back 30,000 pickled ears and noses of Chinese and Koreans killed in battle. These they buried in what is now known as the Ear Mound in the city of Kyoto. It was around this period that something new came into the midst of this warring, bloodthirsty people. Something new and strange. In the year 1521, Magellan had sailed around the world to the Philippines. In his wake came Spanish and Portuguese missionaries who eventually visited the Japanese islands. The strange new thing they brought was Christianity, the revolutionary doctrine of peace on earth and the equality and brotherhood of man. Here was something that dignified the lowly Japanese serfs as human beings. Soon there were some 200 churches and over 200,000 converts. The warlords became frightful. These foreign medicine men were teaching tolerance, brotherly love, peace, and even equality. So they acted. 137 churches were destroyed in Nagasaki. All Christian converts in Tokyo were burned at the stake. Throw out the West. Throw out its poisonous doctrine of peace. And with that, Japan closed its doors. No one could leave Japan. No one could enter. Foreign sailors shipwrecked on their shores were tortured and beheaded. For 200 years, Japan remained completely isolated. And in those 200 years, the world advanced more than it had in the previous 1,000 years. Voltaire lived, and Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Pasteur. The Americans fought a revolution for the belief that all men were created equal. The French fought for liberty, equality, and fraternity. The power of steam was discovered, and the steamboat and steam engine began to narrow the oceans and continents. The telegraph was invented. China was opened up to the trade of the world. But during all this time, Japan was closed. No news reached her shores. She remained a nation blacked out from the rest of the world, still living in the Middle Ages. Then, in 1853, just 92 years ago, Commodore Perry's American fleet of 4 ships sailed into Yokohama, bearing a message from President Fillmore offering the hand of friendship and the interest of trade. The Japanese warlords woke with a shock from their 200 years of self-imposed isolation. They realized that the hairy white barbarian had machines and weapons that made him powerful. In 1868, the warlords did away with the position of shogun and elevated Emperor Meiji to supreme dictatorship over all Japan, reserving for themselves and themselves alone the right to speak for him and to guide his policies, a position the warlords have hung on to ever since. Now for a strong military. The paid warriors, the samurai, were too few for a national army, so they introduced another revolutionary idea into Japanese life. The sons of peasants were suddenly permitted the great privilege of bearing arms, and it was a great privilege, for being a soldier almost meant being a noble. And to sell this program to the Jap masses, the warlords shrewdly used religion. They revised ancient Shintoism to suit their purpose and forced emperor worship, military glorification, and fanatic thoughts of conquest to be preached by all Shinto priests. Thus, Japan rid herself of the old samurai, but their fanatical spirit was passed on to the new peasant soldier, Bushido code and all. The warlords now flung open their doors to the West. Posts and telegraphs were introduced, railroads, the European calendar, photography, European dress. A frenzy of modernization seized upon the land. With a politeness such as the world has seldom seen, the Japanese invited other nations to help them build up their military power. And always with the thought, treat with the foreigner, learn his weapons, and then use them to destroy him. The old Bushido double cross. The English, having the best navy in the world, were invited to build up and train the Japanese navy. The French, supposed to have the best army in the world, were invited to train the Japanese army. But when they saw the French defeated by the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War, the Japanese switched to German advisors for their army. From the English and the Americans, they borrowed the outward forms of democracy, the ministers and their representative body, the Diet. But this was all a cruel joke, for the Army and Navy cabinet ministers, still actually descendants of the old feudal barons, are above and beyond any law-making body. They have direct access to the emperor and can entirely bypass the civil government. In fact, whatever Japan took from the West or the Chinese, the warlords never took the moral or ethical principles that went with them. All modern knowledge that has come to the Japanese people, all culture, all ideas, all thinking has been filtered through to the people from the top down. Any new idea is first tried out by the ruling classes, changed to suit their purpose, then with the emperor's blessing handed down to the people as divine law. In spite of westernization, everyone in Japan still rules over his inferior and in turn bows down to his superiors just as they did in the Middle Ages. Women have the least standing of all. They must obey the males in all things. Even today, there isn't any moral right or wrong in Japan. Merely, are you or are you not obedient to your superiors? For instance, today, a father still has the power to sell his daughter when she is 11 or 12 to a factory or a mill. She will eat, sleep, and go to school in the factory, but all her earnings will go to her father. Or if she is a little older and he needs money, the father can sell her outright to a geisha house or house of prostitution. And modernization has done even less for the standard of living. Individual welfare still doesn't count. Discomfort is supposed to be a divine virtue. And that's why the people of Japan all work as long as they can, and as soon as they can, and as hard as they can. For they, too, consider themselves as soldiers with a divine mission. These women beat the earth in humble rhythm, just as they did 1,000 years ago. These women work day after day, month after month in the rice fields. Human machines producing rice and soldiers. Over their heads fly the latest planes to the wars. A diesel train thunders past. But these farmers work and live and eat like they did in the 17th century. The income for the whole family, as high as $150 a year and as low as $16 a year. The Jap peasant works harder, eats less, and pays more taxes than any other peasant on earth. But he seldom complains, for he is carrying out the divine will of the emperor. The white-collar Japanese in the daytime uses telephones and adding machines. But when he goes home, he puts on a kimono and lives as his ancestors did in the Middle Ages. Japanese houses have no foundations. There are no walls as we know them. No windows, no paint, no varnish, no curtains, no chairs, and no beds. To sleep, they spread a couple of quilts on the floor with no sheets and lay their heads on hard, round pillows. Their food lacks albumin, fats, and sugar. The standard of living is the same as it was hundreds of years ago, one of the lowest on earth. For Japan became industrialized not to raise the standard of living, but to prepare for conquest. This man in the factory doesn't work a 6-day, 48-hour week for good wages. He works a 72-hour week at starvation wages and frequently dies of tuberculosis at the age of 40.
Why do Japan's millions accept their fate in dumb, regimented silence? Why don't they rebel, revolt, organize labor unions? Well, first of all, having dedicated their lives to the emperor, belief in Japan's divine mission to conquer runs through the whole people. This makes practically all of them willing prisoners of a vicious, ironclad social structure, a system of regimentation so perfect it made Hitler's mouth water. On top of the heap of this social structure are leaders of the Army and Navy, the warlords who surround the emperor. They are Japan's first team. Nearly equal in power are the half-dozen super-rich industrial aristocratic families who own the wealth. They're the second team. And they play ball with the military rulers because the warlords give them cheap, uncomplaining labor and lush profits. And they, in turn, provide the money for the war machines. Next in line are the professional politicians who are appointed by the government as rulers over the 47 provinces. These political stooges slavishly follow orders because their jobs and their very lives depend on the whims of the Army and Navy leaders. At the bottom of the heap are the peasants and workers, the hoi polloi, the masses. About 10,000 people a year are arrested for thinking bad, selfish, dangerous thoughts. To keep the aristocrats and government officials from straying from the straight and narrow Japanese line, there is another strictly Japanese invention. Secret organizations like the dreaded Black Dragon Society. This secret gangster organization, made up of thousands of fanatics, was headed by one of the world's most sinister characters, Mitsuru Toyama, chief of Japan's Murder Incorporated, sometimes called the unofficial emperor. 90 years old when he died in 1944, This dreaded master murderer held the threat of death over everyone in Japan who dared oppose the warlords too strongly. 1930. Premier Hamaguchi shot down at his desk. 1932. Prime Minister Inukai. Finance Minister Inouye. Baron Takuma Dan, head of the House of Mitsui. 1936. 4 political leaders killed. Prime Minister escapes. Brother-in-law shot by mistake. But the main reason the warlords have been able to maintain their vicious grip on Japan lies in the educational system. Education is compulsory in Japan. 97% of the Japs are literate. But a Japanese school is not an institution for the development of the mind. It is a government-controlled institution designed to teach only officially selected facts and officially approved ideas. The object is to mass-produce students who all think alike. To teach in the shortest possible time only the knowledge and skills necessary to make the student an obedient, loyal subject of the divine emperor. The children are taught only how to do things. Their minds absorb the official lessons like a sponge absorbs water. And like a squeezed sponge, they give back the same water. Teachers are trained only by the government, and only those fanatically loyal to the emperor are allowed to teach. Thus, from childhood, the Japanese are taught they are descendants of gods, a race apart and superior to all others, born for only one purpose, to dedicate their lives to the emperor. The cardinal virtue, obedience to superiors. The cardinal ambition, Ako Ichiu, to cover the earth under a Japanese roof. That is, briefly, the social structure of Japan. That is the vicious system of political and religious regimentation that hammers, kneads, and molds the whole population until it becomes an obedient mass with but a single mind.
By 1894, the warlords thought they were ready for their first modern test of strength. As usual, their first move was against China. The process was simple. You send your armies over and attack. The Japs got the island of Formosa. On February 8, 1904, the Japs stepped into the big league. Without warning, they attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. 3 days later, they remembered to declare war. By defeating Russia, they temporarily obscured that country's influence in the Pacific. The Japanese were delirious. They had arrived. They had defeated their first major world power. And 6 years later, in 1910, they simply marched in and annexed Korea. In 1914, during the First World War, the Japanese, correctly figuring the Allies would win, declared war on Germany, took the Shantung Peninsula from the Germans, and grabbed off the German-owned Marshall, Caroline, and Mariana Islands. After the war, the Japanese emissaries signed anything and everything. League of Nations, disarmament agreement, 9-power treaty. But they insisted on keeping the Marshalls and Carolines and declared them taboo to all foreigners. Ako Ichiu was coming true. The Japs couldn't seem to make mistakes. They won every war in the field and in politics. Every time they tangled with the West, they got new territory. The warlords grew more popular than ever. In 1927, one of them, Baron Chitanaka, made out a secret modern blueprint to achieve this mad dream and handed it to the emperor. It is called the Tanaka Memorial, Japan's Mein Kampf. It was a simple plan, but carefully thought out. To cover the earth with a Japanese roof, the Japs had first to conquer Asia. To conquer Asia, they needed manpower and raw materials. China had the manpower. Manchuria had iron and coal. So Manchuria would be first, then China. The next step was Siberia with its vast resources of timber, coal, wheat, and metals. Then south into Malaysia and the East Indies with its fabulous empire of tin, oil, and rubber. The United States was the last step. And when the orange groves of California and the cotton fields of Alabama were part of Japan's empire, When the factories of Los Angeles and Detroit were producing for Japan's war machine, then the rest of the world would fall like a ripe plum, and the Japs would have fulfilled Jimu's divine command to cover the 8 corners of the world with a Japanese roof. That was the plan, the blueprint, the specifications for world conquest. But the Japanese are careful people. There was much to do, many details to prepare at home and abroad before putting the plan into action. First, make sure of the home front, for in spite of every conceivable method of thought control, certain Western ideas were seeping into Japan, especially among city people. So Western music was banned. Instead, the government approved this. Western dancing was forbidden. Western movies were thrown out, and the people were made to see pictures of their ancient war heroes. Musicals began singing the praises of the Axis. Western card games were purged in favor of this. It's a game of super chess called Go. Actually, it is a game of military strategy. Western books and magazines not in accord with Japanese militarism were banned. Baseball was becoming Japan's national sport. It was popularized in Japan by visiting American teams. In 1931, an all-star team led by Lou Gehrig, Al Simmons, and Lefty Grove played in Tokyo to standing room only. The warlords became afraid of baseball. They tried to stop it. And when later on, Babe Ruth was brought over by a Tokyo newspaper publisher, the hatchet men acted. One night, the newspaper publisher was found butchered to death. To try to take the place of baseball, the rulers encouraged the old Shinto-approved sports like sumo, kendo, and judo. Judo, or jiu-jitsu, is the act of giving in, making your opponent lose his balance, then trip him, choke him, hit, chop, poke, or kick his vital spots. The way of gentleness, it's called. Jap diplomats think in terms of judo. For example, make an offer of peace just before you intend to attack. Kendo means the way of the sword. There's no defense in kendo. It's all offense. You either kill or are killed. The Jap army thinks in terms of kendo. Sumo, or Japanese wrestling, is the act of calmly waiting or stalling for time. Then a swift charge to overcome your opponent. The Japanese people think in terms of sumo. Calm, peaceful, serene, like their volcano Mount Fuji, with violent eruptions of brutal passions in between. But even as they hammered their home front into shape, the gentlemen of Japan were softening up the rest of the world for their Tanaka plan. To every country marked for conquest, they sent their agents. Army officers posing as laborers, shopkeepers, gardeners. Along the coasts, officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, masquerading as fishermen, piloted tiny boats equipped with diesel engines and radio sending sets. They fished for pearls off the South Pacific Islands. They fished for tuna off the coast of California. They made some good hauls. Other Japanese traveled widely as tourists, photographing the sights of Honolulu and Seattle. Something to show the folks back home. Still others went to work in barber shops. Strange barbers who didn't talk. All this information was collected, studied, filed away in Tokyo, ready for use when the day came for the army to go into action. Wherever Japanese spies went, Japanese propaganda followed, especially in Asia. The message was simple.
The white man is exploiting you. Drive him out. Asia for the Asiatics. Japan is your protector.
Here at San Francisco, for example, Convoys were being made up within sight of possible Axis agents. There were more Japanese in Los Angeles than in any other area. At nearby San Pedro, houses and hotels occupied almost exclusively by Japanese were within a stone's throw of a naval air base, shipyards, oil wells. Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships. Japanese farmers were living close to vital aircraft plants. So as a first step, all Japanese were required to move from critical areas such as these. But of course, this limited evacuation was a solution to only part of the problem. The larger problem, the uncertainty of what would happen among these people in case of a Japanese invasion, still remained. That is why the commanding general of the Western Defense Command determined that all Japanese within the coastal area should move inland. Immediately, the Army began mapping evacuation areas and for a time encouraged the Japanese to leave voluntarily. But trouble for the voluntary evacuees soon threatened in their new locations. So the program was quickly put on a planned and protected basis. Thereafter, the American citizen Japanese and Japanese aliens made plans in accordance with orders. Notices were posted. All persons of Japanese descent were required to register. They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration. Civilian physicians made preliminary medical examinations. Government agencies helped in 100 ways. They helped the evacuees find tenants for their farms. They helped businessmen lease, sell, or store their property. Now, this aid was financed by the government, but quick disposal of property often involved financial sacrifice for the evacuees. Now the actual migration got underway. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort. In small towns as well as large, up and down the coast, the moving continued. Behind them, they left shops and homes they had occupied for many years. Their fishing fleets were impounded and left under guard. Now they were taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. They lived here until new pioneer communities could be completed on federally owned lands in the interior. Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons. The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all. The residents of the new community set about developing a way of life as nearly normal as possible. They held church services, Protestant, Catholic, and Buddhist. They issued their own newspaper, organized nursery schools, and some made camouflage nets for the United States Army. Meanwhile, in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and elsewhere, quarters were being built where they would have an opportunity to work and more space in which to live. When word came that these new homes were ready, the final movement began. At each relocation center, evacuees were met by an advance contingent of Japanese who had arrived some days earlier and who now acted as guides. Naturally, the newcomers looked about with some curiosity. They were in a new area, on land that was raw, untamed, but full of opportunity. Here they would build schools, educate their children, reclaim the desert. Their own physicians took precautions to guard against epidemics. They opened advanced Americanization classes for college students, who in turn would instruct other groups. They made a rough beginning at self-government, for while the Army would guard the outer limits of each area, community life and security within were largely up to the Japanese themselves. They immediately saw the need for developing civic leaders. At weekly community meetings, citations were given to the block leaders who had worked most diligently. Special emphasis was put on the health and care of these American children of Japanese descent. Their parents, most of whom are American citizens, and their grandparents, who are aliens, immediately wanted to go to work. At Manzanar, they built a lath house and began rooting guayuli cuttings. The plants, when mature, will add to our rubber supply. At Parker, they undertook the irrigation of fertile desert lands. Meanwhile, in areas away from the coast and under appropriate safeguards, many were permitted to enter private employment, particularly to work in sugar beet fields where labor was badly needed. Now, this brief picture is actually the prologue to a story that is yet to be told. The full story will begin to unfold when the raw lands of the desert turn green, when all adult hands are at productive work on public lands or in private employment. It will be fully told only when circumstances permit the loyal American citizens once again to enjoy the freedom we in this country cherish, and when the disloyal, we hope, have left this country for good. In the meantime, we are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency. And we won't change this fundamental decency no matter what our enemies do. But of course, we hope most earnestly that our example will influence the Axis powers in their treatment of Americans who fall into their hands.